So I've just finished watching The Age of Disclosure. One of the main points that I want to that I pulled from it personally is it seemed to validate Bob Lazar's story, which goes back, to the 1980s. Bob Lazar's never changed his story; he's always stuck to the same story all these years. And in this documentary, we've got Dr. Hal Puthoff and Dr. Eric Davis describing how these exotic aerial phenomena, UAPs, how they work, their propulsion system. They describe bending of space-time and warp fields and curvature of space. I'll put in the clip for you here. But what they describe is exactly what Bob Lazar described all those years ago. It does seem to back up Lazar's claim. Personally, I've always felt like Bob Lazar was telling the truth. He does have some or a lot of skeptics that think he's lying. However, if he is lying, he was on the money, because what they're claiming in this documentary backs up exactly what Bob Lazar said so many years ago. But before we get into the clips, just a general quick overview. I'm not going to give you a detailed review of the film in case I don't want to give too many spoilers. But as someone who has watched a lot of material over the years, I didn't really get anything new from this that I didn't already know or that I've not already heard about. Some of the clips were kind of a little bit vague from direct experiences, where you can find hour-long interviews with them on YouTube from people like Jesse Michaels. Is a good example where he's got, multiple hour interviews with some of the people that are featured in this documentary. In the documentary, their cases are very glazed over. You get like 10 seconds of explanation and that's it, where there's really a lot more detail, obviously, to the case that would have been interesting for people watching that may never have heard about these cases. You don't hear the details. You get a little snippet of a brief bit of information, then it's on to the next clip. It seems a lot of news clips, Congress clips, television clips kind of all merged together throughout the whole documentary. I did find it a little bit tiresome in the way that it was edited that way. But like I say, if you've got a general interest in the subject, I really don't think you're going to get a whole lot of new information from this. One new kind of bit of information that I've not really heard before was one gentleman describing having some kind of medical effect, and he claimed as a statistic that 25% of people that come into contact with UAPs at close range, basically there's a 25% mortality rate within a certain period of time. I think it was about 7 years. And so that's kind of shocking if that's true, but he didn't go into any detail whatsoever about what his health implications were. He didn't show any medical records. He didn't show literally anything. We've got no idea what's wrong with him, and does not elaborate. And that is kind of frustrating throughout the whole documentary, is there's never any follow through. A statement is made and there's no backup to it.
I spent 10 years as an intelligence officer for the Navy, and before that, 6 years as Air Force intelligence. And I spent time on the UAP task force. I'm one of the intelligence officials that has experienced biological effects of encountering UAP. Since my first encounter, I've observed other craft, orbs, we'll call it exotic energy fields. Unfortunately, those of us who have investigated it, we become part of the investigation or investigated by our colleagues. The population had about a 25% mortality rate within 7 years of having an interaction. Probably important that the public understands that this is more than just an aerial phenomena.
Tying into that little bit of snippet of being annoyed by those kinds of things is Jay Stratton's claim that he saw alien bodies and craft. There's no follow-up, there's no detail. He makes the statement, it's dropped, no one gives a follow-up question, do you want to explain what they look like? Nothing. It's one little statement that you see in the trailer and that's it. It's not mentioned again. That's kind of frustrating. So in general, I think the movie is fine, or the documentary is fine for the general audience, the general population of people that may have a vague interest or maybe no interest. I think it's great for them. For anyone that's got any kind of in-depth knowledge, or you've watched a few YouTube podcasts and YouTube channels, you're not really going to learn really anything new from this. They do spin a threat narrative throughout. However, they also mention towards the end that it's potentially humans that are the threat to the ETs, and that they're observing us as the threat because they see that we're warring with nuclear weapons and we're getting ready to go out into space, into the cosmos, and they're going to have to deal with us as this kind of warmongering species heading out into space with that kind of attitude is not really ideal for them. So those are the kind of the key points for me from the documentary, but we're going to get into what I personally found the most interesting, again, was this seemingly backing up of Lazar's claims, which, if you're not familiar with Lazar, I'm sure everyone watching this would be, but I would suggest going back and watching excerpts of the government Bible. You can find on YouTube, and these are videos that were done, I think, in the early 1990s with Bob Lazar going in depth, and he talks about the propulsion, how it works, his whole experience, but also going into the briefing documents that he read while he was at S4. I just thought that was fascinating, that it really does back up his claim and validates him to some degree, I think.
With enough energy, you could create a bubble, a warp bubble, around a spacecraft that would have a different property of space-time inside the bubble than on the outside of the bubble.
This energy field would completely isolate the craft from the environment. So you might ask then, how does the craft actually move forward within its bubble?
The craft inside the bubble has a way of altering the bubble's properties in order to change its direction of motion,
such that you have a downward press in front and an upward press behind. So it'd be like riding space-time in the same way that a surfer would ride a wave in the ocean. And we observe hypersonic velocity and instantaneous acceleration. And the reason is that time is moving differently for people inside the bubble versus people outside the bubble. Whoever's inside the craft would feel like they're just cruising along. They wouldn't be feeling the effects of what looks like speeds and accelerations that would turn a human being into pudding. This one breakthrough can be the key to interstellar travel, where you want to travel long distances without taking enormous amounts of subjective time. We'd also have low observability because the bubble acts as a barrier between two space-time environments. This would eliminate or conceal most of the known signatures of conventional technologies. This is why radar would have difficulty tracking a craft, because the signal from the radar would be distorted by the energy field around the craft.
The radar signatures literally just move around the bubble and doesn't reflect back to the radar emitter.
So it's not surprising when someone takes a photo of a UAP, they find they get a fuzzy and distorted picture because they're actually taking a photo through a space-time barrier. What's been happening recently is that we have upgraded our sensor systems on our fighter aircraft. And these images that are now picked up with our advanced sensor systems, we can begin to see the actual structure of the energy field around a craft, which in the past they would not have been able to do. We also observe transmedium travel because the craft is moving within its own space-time, and the outside environment through which it's moving is inconsequential. This would allow a craft to go seamlessly from space through the atmosphere and into the water.
And they could do so because the warp bubble that surrounds them shunts air molecules or ocean water molecules around the craft so that it can move effortlessly through any medium.
Generates its own gravitational field. Being inside that field essentially doesn't shield you, but essentially you're in and this is a terrible way to say it, almost in a different realm, because you're now influenced only by that gravitational field. For instance, people wonder how a craft like this can make a turn at such high speed, a 90-degree turn, when they would imagine people slamming up against the wall or something to that effect. Well, that really wouldn't happen. Inertia would have no effect. You're in a distortion. And don't forget that gravity distorts time and space, so really nothing is going to influence you while you're in there.
And if you could see the space-time distortion, this is how it would look. As you can see, as the output of the gravitational field from the amplifiers becomes more intense, the form of space-time around the disk not only bends upward, but at maximum distortion actually folds over into almost a heart shape around the top of the disk. Now remember, this space-time distortion is taking place 360 degrees around the disk. So if you were looking at the disk from the top, the space-time distortion would be in the shape of a donut. When the gravitational field around the disk is so intense that the space-time distortion around the disk achieves maximum distortion and is folded up into this heart-shaped form, the disk can't be seen from any vantage point, and for all practical purposes is invisible. All you could see would be the sky surrounding it.
Describe the gravity amplifiers for us and some of their different operating configurations.
There are 3 amplifiers. The craft can operate on a single one, can lift off the ground. The way in which it's propelled are 2 different ways. There's what they call Omicron configuration, where the craft is using one generator, or Delta configuration, where it's utilizing all 3. Delta configuration would be for space travel. Essentially, the craft will tilt up on its side, as opposed to a science fiction movie where you see a flying saucer moving around. The craft will tilt up on its side, focus the 3 gravity generators to a single point, and move through space that way. Moving around the source of gravity is a problem to a disk because it's interference, essentially. So what they do is they work with that interference to their benefit. They'll use one gravity generator to lift the craft off the ground. And as opposed to what we're used to, for instance, a plane, once it's in the air, we envision thrust or some force coming out the back of it to push it forward. The crafts work completely opposite of that. What they do is once they're hovering in the air, they'll swing the 2 remaining gravity generators up in front of them and create a distortion, essentially a downhill, and the craft rolls downhill for infinity. It's always chasing a little distortion. That's why they look goofy when they fly around at low speed, because they're essentially, and any time you run over, the gravity field around the Earth is not completely constant and stable, depending on the minerals and density of the Earth underneath it. The gravity will vary somewhat, and you will get odd movements of the craft. So its low-speed mode is kind of unstable for the most part. I only witnessed one test flight up close, officially. That I was just inside the hangar. The test was going off probably, just as the sun was going down, and it was a low-performance test. I believe there were some pilots or test pilots in the craft. The craft must have been retrofitted to fit them, because the seating arrangements were really not accommodating. They were in radio communication with the craft, which is kind of surprising to me, because the gravity waves that the craft was producing should have distorted the radio waves also. So apparently there's something there that I don't understand. The craft lifted off the ground, virtually noiseless, other than a small corona discharge on the bottom of the craft, indicating the presence of high voltage. That dissipated at about 30 feet, and it stood there completely silently, and moved over to the left, to the right, and sat back down. That was the entire test. However, that was an extremely impressive test.
There was talk of weapon systems, that there were different projects. Project Galileo, Project Sidekick was supposed to be weapon applications of the craft. Project Looking Glass had to do with time, any effects of time in the craft. Now, I don't think, we're not talking about making a time machine like in science fiction, but we're talking about, small distortions, intentional distortions of time, and how that can be used, as a, not as a, well, it was part of a weapon program.
How are you informed in this?
These, again, were just the small briefings that I read. But again, I don't really like to talk about those because I don't have any information on them, and it was just, small briefings.
But you told Commander Fravor that what he saw might have been a time dilation and not
well, it could be
propulsion.
because gravity affects time, space-time. I'm sure you've heard of that. And, what Commander Fravor saw as he was in the F-18 approaching it, he said he described it as a ping pong ball in a cup and shaking it back and forth. It was moving that fast. Now, obviously, if there's anything inside there, it's going to be battered to hell. But, my point was that, well, one of two things. Either there's a gravitational envelope in there which negates any inertia effects, or you are seeing through a gravity distortion field. So, just like you're looking at a hot highway and you see, an optical distortion going through there. Well, the same thing happens in gravity, and the craft may not actually be moving like that. It may just look like it because you can only see it through the field. So it may be making much more gentle moves. I'm not saying that's it, but it has to be one of the two.
If you watched it, please leave your thoughts and comments below. Do you think it will change anything? Do you think it will move the needle at all? I'm not sure it will much, but what I think might happen is it might trigger a new wave of whistleblowers or people coming forward that feel safer to do so because some higher ranking people have come forward and put their name to it and said, yes, this is real. It's kind of destigmatizing things, which I think is very important. I see in the comment sections, even on channels that talk about this subject, if someone mentions in the comments, and this is from personal experience of seeing this, someone might mention, I did CE5 and I saw an orb and it appeared and disappeared instantly, and they're recounting an experience, and you'll get people commenting below, laughing at them and saying, sure you did, lol. Like, people are very dismissive and automatically assume people are lying, which is, for me, an indication that really people are not ready for disclosure, because people are still laughing at it and mocking it and accusing people of lying immediately. That's their first go-to reaction, is laughter, mocking, presuming someone is lying, rather than any kind of open-mindedness that their worldview might be a little bit wrong and maybe these people are telling the truth. So hopefully this movie goes some way into reducing that kind of bullshit that I see even today, which is, sad, I think. Leave your thoughts, what you think about the documentary, and I'll see you again with another video. Goodbye.
Obviously, the ET craft do exist. Something had to build them, so there must be aliens. And since there are and the craft are there must be some sort of factory and an entire civilization somewhere.